Hello, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a significant change that will inform the rest of this course and hopefully your understanding of why things are the way they are today. It's an important historic change worth talking about, and I would like you to know it here. Draw a little on the slide. Uh, for the purposes of this class, we're going to divide Western history into two eras that I'd like you to know. Now, these two eras I'd like you to also note are not hard and fast in terms of the dates I'm presenting. The dates are just points of reference and somewhat arbitrary. I'd like you to know this as a vulgar history. Okay, so what I mean by that is please don't run to an historian and say, hey, Borchard explained the big breakdown of Western Europe to me and now I know these things. It won't work. There's a lot more to this and finer details, but this gives us a broad understanding of a huge social change that informs all of sociology. Now, I also want to briefly touch on, why am I talking about Western history and what is this thing? We in the United States tend to see Western history as our received history. And the way that you can think about this is if you go through and think about what you've been taught all the way up until this point as the important people in history. So if, for example, I were to ask you, who are the most famous composers you can think of? You might say Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart. If I were to ask you who are the greatest figures in literature, probably most people would think to themselves Shakespeare. If we were to talk about the greatest philosophers, you might say Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. If we were to talk about the greatest painters, probably certain names come to mind: Monet, Manet, Van Gogh, Rubens, Da Vinci. He did a little painting, and Rembrandt. So what I'm trying to say is that all of those names, what they have in common is they're all dead, white, European males. So our received history is very much what we think of as the best of culture and ideas comes from Western Europe. Now, I want to make it clear that many other cultures had very significant insights and contributions to humanity. The Chinese, for example, invented paper. You could also say, Middle Eastern people, that's where we get our numeral system from, Arabic numerals. But again, this is something that we tend to stress in terms of trying to understand why our historic process, and I should say progress, has come about the way it has. Okay, the two eras I want to stress today are the traditional versus the modern era. And the traditional, you can think of, generally speaking, again, pre-1600 Europe. The modern era, roughly, you could say, falls 1750 to 1950. Some people believe we're in the late modern era today. Some people think we are in what's been called the postmodern era, or after the modern. And we'll hopefully talk about that at a later date. Between those two dates I noted above falls an event that is crucial to know about, called the Enlightenment. And what I would like you to know, the Enlightenment is this, again, extremely important intellectual movement that occurred in Western Europe, promoting four key things. Here they are. First, Enlightenment thinkers, who were sometimes called philosophers, promoted first reason and rationality. These thinkers were moving away from religion as a source of truth and promoting things like logic and the idea of causal relationships that they could see and explain. So reason is, again, a very, very different idea away from just a faith-based understanding of the world and belief-based understandings. Science and secularization is the second change I'd like you to note. Science here is rooted in what is called empiricism. So empiricism you can define as experience derived from the senses. So what are these senses? For our purposes, you can think of as 5 senses: touch, taste, sight, sound, smell. It's important to note that these are not based on faith. Science, again rooted in empiricism, I should also stress, is not simply experience derived from individuals' senses, but someone who's looking for systematic patterns over time and working with other people who are doing the same type of process in order to generate data and develop information, again, patterns about cause and effect and relationships that can be shared and individually scrutinized to see their worth. So that's a very different set of sources for information as opposed to belief, tradition, religion, etc. Secularization, very briefly put, the idea of moving away from religion as a source of truth. Progress is a value that we might not even see as a value today. We just think progress is good. In the traditional period, though, this wasn't a value. The idea was you wanted to be more like your ancestors. They were the people who really understood the world and were to be emulated. After the Enlightenment, there was a belief with humans that we can somehow improve upon the world and make it a better place. We don't have to have diseases. We can create medicine. We can do things like print with the Gutenberg Bible, distribute information through printed books. The development of the steam engine in England, that helped promote the Industrial Revolution, the idea we can produce products en masse. And today we have incredible innovations that have occurred, from the atom being split to being able to put human beings on the moon, map out the human genome, the human DNA. Incredible things we've been able to accomplish. Finally, individual freedom was also promoted by Enlightenment thinkers, and this is connected with the rights that people have. In the traditional period, rights were based really on your collective status. So if you were a member of the clergy, you had certain rights and responsibilities. If you were a serf, again, different rights and responsibilities. A nobleman would also have certain rights and responsibilities. With the Enlightenment, individuals became the source for those rights and freedoms. So in the United States, with the Bill of Rights, you see in 1776 the notions that we have the freedom to assemble, freedom of speech, freedom to choose your own religion. A huge difference from the past. Also, I should note, in 1789, a very crucial date in world history, you saw the French Revolution, which stressed, of course, those 3 ideas: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, I think we can move on and check out this chart outlining these broad patterns of social change rooted largely in the Enlightenment. So here's the chart, which is again a very vulgar history of Western Europe, but useful for the purposes of us to make conversations about the big reason sociology exists. Sociology was about explaining the social change between the traditional period and moving into the modern period, because this was a very frightening, hard change for people. If you can imagine your whole worldview being turned upside down within a period of, a couple, 3 generations, this is a crucial thing to think about. So let's walk through this. In the traditional period, you had the dominance largely of the Catholic Church. Now, other churches were coming. The Protestants, for example, Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, which is rooted in the word protest. But the Catholic Church was very strong in Europe at the time. Now, the root of political power in Europe was the monarchy. So if the Catholic Church was the root of basically truth the understanding of why the world the way it was the way it was. The monarchs derived their power from divine right. And that means basically they were chosen by God. So that's an amazing source of power. If you were, for example, to break the law of a land, ultimately you were breaking the laws that were created by the monarchs, and that meant you were violating God's law. So very, very bad things would happen to you if you violated the law in, for example, medieval times. This also stressed the notion of people as subjects, so you were a subject of a monarch or an empire. The dominant way that the economic resources were distributed, feudalism, I mentioned in the last slide. This is basically a system where things are produced for immediate consumption. So you don't have development of a lot of trade. Now again, this is a vulgar history. There were trading centers pre-1600 in Europe, like Venice, for example, and Rome. But what happens is after the Enlightenment, you start to see these really starting to take off exponentially, and trade becomes much more central to life. What was the most important source of self-identity during this period? Your communal ties. You generally lived, on average, about 50 years during this period. You lived in a small village where you knew the people around you. You were known by largely your first name or your father's name. You, as I said, lived about 50 years. You never left probably a radius of about 50 miles. And that was your life, the community that you're from. Religion, I mentioned before, was the central source of truth, and we're going to move away from that when we enter into the modern era. Extended families you can think of as 3 or more generations under one roof or in close proximity to each other. Now, why were extended families dominant during this period? Well, largely because this was an agricultural and guild-based production system. So people wanted large families in order to have farm hands, to have labor that would help them work on the fields. And of course, that relates directly with the idea of things being rurally based in this period. Then, of course, we had the Enlightenment, and you've got this shift over roughly 150 years or so. Again, not hard and fast dates. But you move here away from religion, and one religion being a source of truth, to a diversity of Judeo-Christian faiths. Of course, Judaism was the source for Christianity. And during the Middle Ages, again, I mentioned this before, the dominance of the church. In the past, in Europe, you would see the church as really the center of these small towns. They would be the places where you would have the best architecture. They'd often be the tallest buildings in those towns. You probably have been to churches where the acoustics were just superb. And so these were places that were designed to create a sense of awe and reverence. As we move toward the modern era, you start to see people saying, well, let's think about other religions, and a diversity of Judeo-Christian faiths emerge. The source of political power also changes. We move away from monarchies and empires toward the development of what are called nation states. A nation is a people. So, for example, as a joke, we think about Husker Nation, which is all the people spread around who are fans of the Huskers, right? A people and a state you can think of as a form of government. So we've moved away from people being subjects of a monarch to people becoming citizens of a state. We see the development of different states like Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, breaking away from empires. The form of production, the form of economics that was dominant in this modern period came to be dominant, capitalism. And that's production for trade. So with the development of factories, you see the buying and selling of all kinds of stuff. Now, if you talk about feudalism, a big difference here. There was trade during feudalism, but land could not be bought or sold. That was inherited. That was the only way you could get land. In capitalism, a big shift, everything can be bought and sold. So this is huge. The most important source of self-identity, you move away from communal ties as people move to cities toward smaller family ties, and also work as a dominant source of thinking about who you are and your place within the world. So your grandparents probably, if they went to cocktail parties, one of the first questions people would ask is, what do you do, right? So those, again, grow smaller as sources of identity and change. We move from religion over to organized science. Now, science, again, was pre-existing the 1600s. You see people like Galileo and Copernicus, working in this cutting edge. However, organized science, again, really took off in the modern period. You see the development of things like learned societies, journals, which help spread and disperse scientific information and knowledge. And so this is a huge hotbed for a change and organized knowledge being spread around different disciplines. Nuclear families are new, and what you start to see as our time has progressed is the family unit is getting smaller and smaller. Nuclear families are very adapted to urban life and also to the idea that you really don't need farmhands anymore. Today it's going to cost you money if you want to have children. They're not going to be an asset for you. They're going to spend a lot of your money and resources. So don't want to be the bearer of bad tidings, but it's true. We've moved from a primarily rural society to today, actually more of the world lives in urban areas than ever before. And with that, you start to see things like a shift away from agricultural and guild-based production systems to industrial-based production with factories. And the development of the steam engine in England was a huge shift toward using mechanized resources in order to produce things, and assembly lines where people were very, very specialized at certain tasks being used to create, again, an amazing amount of stuff. We live in today a post-scarcity world.